So I'm going to be talking about bioactives for mood and mental performance. I'm sort of representing my consulting company today, Motivate Consulting, but I also have appointments at Monash University and Swinburne in Melbourne, Australia, and as of about 2 weeks ago, I split my time between Australia and the UK. These are my disclosures, so I think this is about the last 5 years, although of course the last 2 years have sort of made that a bit of a blur. A mix of funding from various government and industry partners, and I should also say, because I'm going to be talking about some of the work, that I'm Chief Scientific Officer for a company called Arepa Nootropics. Okay, so I think, you know, when we think about aging and why we're interested in the effects of nutrients on aging, it's to do with this cognitive decline and dementia. So if we think about a typical course of, for example, Alzheimer's disease, this is the Alzheimer patient zero, actually, August D., who was the first person to be diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease about 120 years ago. There's very little that can be done about it. If August was diagnosed now, she'd be given one of these current treatments that are listed on the right-hand side there, the cholinesterase inhibitors, and if she was lucky enough, she may be able to tolerate them because they're extremely toxic, and they may have bought her maybe 6 months respite from the symptomatology, but not a cure for the disorder. And in fact, I think the consensus is that these drugs have been spectacularly unsuccessful in terms of their treatment of Alzheimer's disease. And there's a growing consensus that the way in which we might have a realistic approach to Alzheimer's disease is trying to hit earlier. So there are a couple of stages which occur before frank Alzheimer's disease. There's subjective cognitive decline and mild cognitive impairment, which definitely increase the risk for dementia, but really importantly, there are some people who do not convert from these prodromal states into Alzheimer's disease. And that's very important. It seems that prevention, or I actually prefer the word risk reduction, interventions might be implemented earlier in life. And in fact, this is a more formal way of looking at this from the Lancet Commission on Dementia, showing that there are lifestyle factors which may reduce the prevalence of Alzheimer's disease by up to 40%. So if these were implemented, this would have an incredibly profound effect on society and the disorder. So and this is sort of quite interesting for a number of reasons. I think it's also worth remembering that, yeah, we are the 90%. Most of us are mostly healthy for most of our lives. That is, we sit in this middle section on the bell curve where we don't show any clinical syndromes of mental health or cognitive impairment, and unfortunately, most of us aren't at the other end either, the exceptional 5%. We sit there in the middle, but that's a very broad spectrum of abilities, including cognitive abilities. And if we can instigate some kind of treatment which can shift us within that area, that healthy area, it has two effects. One is to optimize mental function on a day-to-day level. So, for example, after a poor night's sleep, or just if we're feeling stressed. But it also reduces the risk of future brain disorders. So we know that by shifting individuals into that optimal brain health state, we reduce the risk of disorders like Alzheimer's disease. And here it is sort of, I guess, mapped out in terms of cognitive function. We've got so-called super-agers, we've got subjective cognitive decline and optimal cognition. And the aim of the research that I've been involved with my research partners over probably 2.5 decades now, is to find ways of shifting people within that healthy area. How do we do that, and why is it important? It's important because when we think about pharmaceutical targets for treating cognitive aging or optimizing cognitive aging and reducing the risk of things like Alzheimer's disease, they do one thing. They attempt to prop up neurotransmitter systems in the brain. And this is almost doomed to failure because the brain is very beautifully balanced in terms of its neurotransmitter systems, of which there are many dozens. They're very finely balanced, and it's very difficult just to tweak a single neurotransmitter system without having an effect on multiple other systems and really putting everything out of balance. If we look at so-called nutra interventions, these are interventions from supplements, from nutrients, from nutraceuticals. They have a much more realistic effect on a number of different processes which we know influence cognitive aging. So things like glucose control, blood flow, cardiovascular function, as we've heard in the previous talk, oxidative stress and inflammation, hormonal activity, psychological stress, and of course the microbiome. And it seems like a more realistic approach to delaying cognitive aging might be to tweak these various systems in the right direction rather than go in and just hammer neurotransmitters. So it's almost like imprecision medicine, that is looking at ways of affecting multiple systems as a kind of fail-safe to prop up cognition. So when we talk about cognition, I'm sort of doing a bit of a left turn here. What do we mean? There are many, many different ways of categorizing aspects of cognition. This is a simple model that we often use when we're looking at cognitive tests, where we think about attention, working memory, secondary memory, and mood. I don't really have time to go into any of these, so I'm going to focus on one, which is working memory. But what I would say, and this is the sort of shameless plug, I guess, for Metivate, is that we are going to be running some workshops on how we measure these different aspects of cognition and how to optimize them and how to design trials. And if you pick up, there's some cards on the plinth over there and on the chair here. There's a barcode there, a QR code. If you scan that, that will send you to details if you're interested in that. So there are tests of looking at this, but I think a good way of thinking about it is when we checked into the conference today, we went to the registration desk and we were bombarded by potentially millions of bits of information every second, but we're able to filter out the ones that aren't relevant. We register there, and we use something like working memory. Working memory might be you're given the Wi-Fi code, and you walk over to your computer, which is over there, and you're sort of rehearsing that Wi-Fi code, and you type it in. But while you're rehearsing that code, you're using working memory. That's as opposed to secondary memory, which is, if I ask you now, what is the Wi-Fi code? Anyone remember? Go on. K2 revolution. So that's when you're using secondary memory, when you are retrieving stored information from memory. So that's as distinct to working memory. And there are hundreds of cognitive tests which are around to test these processes, but interestingly, not all of them are sensitive to the type of interventions that we're interested in. And I guess another way of thinking about it is translating these into everyday functions. So working memory is when you remember a new PIN for a credit card. It goes wrong when, I don't know if anyone's had the experience of walking into a room and thinking, yeah, what did I come in here for? Or picking up your phone because you've got an important text or someone you want to phone, and then forgetting who it is you're ringing. That's when working memory shuts down. And here's another, I think, a really good example, which we've all become all too familiar with over the last couple of years, is where you're asked to do this two-factor authentication. So you're trying to log into an app. It says, okay, we've sent you a code to log in. In the middle panel there, you've got the code there, a 6-digit code. And then, if you're thinking, I'm a bit sharp today, I'm not going to just copy it, I'm going to remember it. And then you switch back to your original app. During that period, you're using your working memory. You're holding the information online and operating on it before you actually utilize it. Okay, and why we're interested in working memory is it's a very interesting predictor of cognitive aging. And if we look at, this is an example of individual slopes of decline in working memory or change in working memory over a 6-year period. This is in a community of Catholic clergy members, And you can see the two lines that are circled there. You've got somebody in their 70s who shows a very rapid decline over that 6 years. But at the top right there, we've got somebody in their late 80s or 90s who starts high and actually maintains their working memory ability over the 6-year period. So, you know, it's interesting to note that there are huge individual differences, and we need to find out what is involved in those differences. And how do we measure them as well? So I've talked about some examples from every day. Formally, we might do a task like digit span. So since we're all here, why don't we do it? So you're going to be presented with a string of numbers, 7, and then 7 numbers, and you have to say them back to me. So here they go. Okay, can you repeat them back? 100%, that's fantastic. What about if I ask you to repeat them backwards? So there are ways of increasing the working memory load by increasing the amount of operations that you would have to do on them. So there's an example. And these often form parts of computerized test batteries which are used to evaluate drugs, but also the effects of nutra types of interventions. I'm just going to talk another example, actually from the bottom one here, the SUCAB battery. And so here, what you're going to do is do a different type of working memory. This is spatial working memory. And what's going to happen is, I'm going to show you this grid, right? And again, we might as well do it since we're all here. And if you're joining online, please feel free to shout out in the cafe or room, wherever you are. So look at these and remember where the white grids are. Then there's going to be a little pause, and you have to say whether that was one or yes or no. Okay, well, that was pretty good. And I think, yeah, we've got of course, you can increase working memory load by increasing the number of squares or increasing the interval between presentation, etc. But those are two ways. And if we look at that second example there, spatial working memory, you can see that this is speed, so up is bad. You can see that with age, spatial working memory ability declines, that is, people get slower, and that's not to do with simple response time. The blue line there is looking at simple reaction time, just pressing a button as fast as you can. And we can use these kind of graphs to look at things. So this is actually the effect of, this is a B vitamin, rich multivitamin, and if we look at the effects of a 16-week trial on women at risk of cognitive decline because of having subjective cognitive impairment, you can see that this supplementation rejuvenated their spatial working memory by 5 to 10 years. So, yeah, that's a very, I think most of us would, I'd certainly go for that if it was available. Here's another example. This is curcumin. I sort of have to apologize for this slide because it was made by my PhD student who I think just discovered PowerPoint animation, but it's, there you go. Always entertaining, but you can see that this is a trial of the Longvida curcumin, and the squares that have got this rosy glow around them, you can see that these have potential effects on brain function and cognitive function. And I think, again, part of the take-home message is that a lot of these natural products have these polypharmacological properties. They don't just zero in on a single neurotransmitter or receptor. They have these multiple properties which are potentially beneficial for brain health. And one thing that we're very interested in this context for a number of reasons is looking at the hippocampus. The hippocampus is an area of the brain which has a role in working memory and other types of memory. And you can see that unlike other areas of the brain, if you look at the graphs on the bottom right, it shows this non-linear change with aging. That is, when you hit about 50 or 60, at a population level, the volume of the hippocampus takes a sudden dive. when we look at ways of testing the hippocampus, one way is something called the pattern separation or mnemonic similarity task. Unfortunately, there isn't a pointer to go through this, but essentially you're presented with an array of pictures, one after the other. You can see that in the box on the top right there, and your job is to say whether or not you've seen the object before. Sometimes that's easy, so if you've got a balloon and you haven't seen that before, that's easy. But the Rubik's Cube, you have seen a Rubik's Cube before, it's just in a slightly different configuration. And the ability to correctly say no to a stimulus which is very similar to a previous stimulus really works the hippocampus, as we can see in the two brain images down at the bottom. So this pattern separation task declines with age. As you can see in this task, this is a huge, nearly 100,000 individuals looking at a similar sort of task. And you can see the decades mapped out along the x-axis there. And with our trial of curcumin, long vida curcumin, you can see that as we got to the much more similar stimuli, the ones that really work the hippocampus hard, is that Rubik's Cube the same as the one you saw before? You can see that curcumin had a benefit. Okay, I'll go through this. Here's another example, which is from neuroberry, which are the berries in arepa. You can see in the top graph there that this inhibits monoamine oxidase. And this is really important because this is not an in vitro study. This is a huge feeding study where people were fed with a handful of berries, not an unrealistic amount, and they had this enzyme measured in their blood. So it was drawn from humans, and you can see that there's this inhibition of monoamine oxidase, which lasts from about 15 minutes for at least 4 hours and has returned to normal 24 hours later. And this inhibition coincides with improvement on, in this case, an attentional test, digit vigilance. So this kind of points to a potential mechanism for cognitive improvement, which is always important. And here's another study using the drink itself, which contains theanine and an antioxidant, pine bark, and vitamin C, looking at another attentional task in elite athletes. So these are people who are recovering from a training session and undergo cognitive testing, and you can see the improvement there from arepa. Okay, and now I'm just going to, for the last 5 minutes, just going to talk about some work we're doing outside of the laboratory, trying to develop apps, because as we know, if you're involved in RCTs, it might as well stand for risky, costly, and time-consuming, because they're very, very resource heavy. And I think a number of factors over the last decade or so, including lockdowns and clinical trials being interrupted halfway through, which certainly happened in my lab and a number of other people that I know, people started to look at the way in which we might be able to test people remotely using apps, and particularly I think for a generation of people who are on their phone most of the day. This could be a really efficient way, I think, of testing cognition. So it's intuitive, it's cost effective, it could be faster, it's scalable, it's flexible. And but there is a problem here. If you start to read the literature about apps, which is something that I've actually only, something I've been aware of it for the last few months actually, is if you look at the two publications listed there at the top, things like star ratings and how easy participants find the apps to use is probably the worst indicator of their utility or the measuring what they're supposed to measure. So things like star ratings really don't give any insight into their efficacy. And then on the right as well, there's another paper saying the same thing. It's the actual treatment potential for the apps was not correlated in any way with how usable people found them, which I think is a problem. And here are a couple of timely articles from The Economist down at the bottom, saying that the mental health apps has caused is a risky industry. And then we've got health apps on the right, which are used much more in the physical domain for things like arthritis and somatic inflammation, showing that they actually do have some utility. So I think one of the challenges in this field is to get the brain mental health type of apps shifted over to have the same kind of quality as the ones used for aspects of physical disease. And this is particularly, I think, relevant because there are 150,000 new apps in this general wellness area every year listed on the Apple Store. And most of these don't really do what they're supposed to do. And also, I think we also have a huge challenge from celebrity endorsements of apps where social media influencers are making claims or just saying that they use these apps. And this has a huge impact on a generation of young people. And this we really need some empirical evidence to support some of the apps. Okay, and here is just one that we're trying to develop. So it's these are apps which are designed to be sensitive to the kind of interventions that I've been talking about. So here's one example where on the left-hand side we've got a cognitive test, we've got a mood test which has been validated, we've got a sleep test. So I think with the right research behind them, there is a place for these kind of apps. And I think this means that we can go away from the straightforward clinical trials. So in the circle there in the middle, we have, I guess, what's been certainly my career for the last few decades, which is looking at clinical trials, asking a question of, does this intervention work? And trying to marry that with mechanistic studies, looking at neuroimaging and the sort of biomarkers that I've talked about earlier. But I think there's definitely a place for this to be complemented with app-based data collection because it's frequent, it can be brief, and it can be scalable, and it could even form part of a clinical trial. And hopefully, if this works properly, we can look at things like implementation, commercialization, get real evidence-based health claims, which is something that's incredibly important, public dissemination, and of course, education. Talking of which, and then I think this is also just worth noting, this is a little exercise that I went through recently. Just went through A to Z and thought, well, how many, can I find 100 substances which are marketed for brain health, and it proved extremely easy. So, you know, with nearly, I think there's not an X there, but people probably think of one, that, you know, there are a huge number of substances which have claims for brain health, but which ones have the evidence? And the answer is the minority. Okay. And so if there's something that you are interested in, Metivate and another company, Kantar, involved in marketing, are doing some online seminars coming up in the coming weeks. There's a QR code there that may work, I don't know. There are the little piles of business cards which have also got that barcode on. So if you're interested, please let me know. Either you know, you can just email me as well. I'll also have a version of these slides available if people want to email me and get a copy. Okay, thank you.